I have Cults to Consciousness, YouTube channel Cults to Consciousness on. So why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on, Owen. I know my audience has been asking for a collab for a long time together, and so I'm glad that we were finally able to connect. I think we have similar missions. At Cults to Consciousness, I basically platform cult survivors, allow them to tell their stories, and we're basically just advocates for anti-coercion, anti-control, anti-abuse. And so there's a lot of heavy stuff that goes on over there, but it's really important work to expose the dark underbellies of these cults.
Yeah, absolutely. So I understand you came out of Mormonism. Is that right? Why don't you tell me your story? What happened?
Yeah, so I grew up in Utah, in the belly of the beast, in probably like really close to Idaho. Most people in Utah don't even know where it is. It's a little town. So kind of in the middle of nowhere. I don't have a crazy, fantastical Mormon story. It was pretty basic, followed all the rules, was a straight A Mormon kid. Just wanted to get to that highest level of heaven, because there's different levels. Wanted to be the ruler of my own planet one day.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you about that in a little while, so I understand, more of the doctrine. But trying to get to the highest level, there are 7 levels, right?
There's 3.
Okay,
well, there's
my
3
mistake.
main levels, and then at the highest level is called the Celestial Kingdom. Within that, there's 3 levels that you can go to there. So in order to get to the highest of the highest, you have to do a whole bunch of things, which we can get to in a little bit.
Yeah.
But essentially, I was just in this bubble, and so I never really questioned it. Everyone just kind of did the Mormon thing. And it wasn't until I moved to Portland, my senior year of high school, that people started asking me these ridiculous questions. And I was just like, where are these even coming from? No, Joseph Smith did not put his head in a hat to translate the Book of Mormon. That's crazy. I didn't know that that was true because they taught us something totally different.
I would have thought that this was widespread information in Mormonism. That's not well known?
No, so because it's so weird. And so they don't technically lie, but they also don't tell you how it happened. So, for example, and some things they do just straight up lie about, but for this example, we would have paintings of Joseph Smith, who is the founder, the prophet, with the Book of Mormon, golden plates next to him, and then he's like writing something down, which he didn't even write it himself because I think he wasn't capable of it. He had a scribe. And so we were just seeing these depictions of him like one hand on the plates and then one hand writing like he's actually translating. We didn't know that he put his head into a hat with a rock and was supposedly seeing the words light up, which the prophet now says, it's like a cell phone. If you can't see your cell phone in the sunlight, you put it in somewhere dark and then you can, see the illuminated things on the screen. And that's how they compare this
Absolutely
special
ridiculous.
rock. Yeah. So I'm getting all of these questions from people and I am just like, what are they even talking about? And so it came to a point where I had an intervention. Someone had an intervention with me in my car. She was my best friend at the time. And she just like pulls out this notebook of all the things that I technically believe. And she's like, you believe this, and you worship Joseph Smith. And Joseph Smith used the hat to translate the Book of Mormon and all of this stuff. And I'm just like, girl, none of that is true. I would know. I'm a Mormon. And I didn't know that most of it was true.
How old were you at this point?
So I was 17 going on 18 because it was my senior year of high school. And so I went to my computer and was like, I'm just going to make sure, I'm going to prove her wrong and get her the real sources because she's clearly just reading anti-Mormon literature. And what I found was really disturbing. And for the first time, I questioned everything. But also at 17, I wasn't ready to completely collapse my faith because that's a huge part of my identity. And so there's one specific moment that I'll never forget. And I've told this before, but I go to this website, and this is before websites were really kind of figured out. They all looked a little janky and weird. And so I was like, I don't know if I can even trust this. But this website had this thing about a temple ordinance. Now, remember, we can't go into the temple until we're permitted. We have to have all of these special recommends. We have to do bishop's interviews. You have to be worthy, and you have to be the right age. It's like all these things. So I wasn't there yet anyway. all you know is that's your goal, is to get there. And you know that they do super, super secret stuff and you want to be a part of it, but you don't know what happens in it.
Right. So the temple, you have normal church services, and then the
Yes.
temple is separate, and only special members can get in. Is that right?
Yes. So the temples are the ones that most people are familiar with. They look like big castles. They're gorgeous and they're kind of gaudy and, you know. So those are not the things you go to every Sunday. You have to be worthy and special to go. So I see on this website, it says when they were doing a temple ceremony, they would have to pretend to slit their throat and cut out their bowels, like with these hand gestures, if they were to reveal the secrets of the temple. And I was like, that's disgusting and culty and weird. And I'm like, Mom, get over here. You got to see this. You got to see what this crazy anti-Mormon website is saying. And I read it to her and I looked over and she's just white staring at me. And I'm like, this isn't true, right? And she's looking at me. And now I'm realizing she's not supposed to say the secrets of the temple, because if this is true, she's made a covenant to slit her own throat.
So you had not been to the temple yet, I guess.
No, I had not been, because I wasn't at the right age and I wasn't technically worthy enough. There's like all these steps. And so she's in this hard place where she's like, do I lie to my daughter or what do I do here? And thankfully I have a super cool mom. She's amazing. And she was like, well, they don't do that anymore. And my heart just dropped. And I'm like, what do you mean? This used to happen? So apparently they took it out around the 90s. So people who've gone through since then haven't been exposed to that. And anyone who's watching this, maybe you're current Mormon and you haven't done that before, will probably think I'm lying. You can go look it up yourself. But yeah, that was the first time that I really questioned, what is this religion that I belong to? But I wasn't willing to tear it all down yet. So I go to Vegas. I go to fashion design school out there. There's a really great community called the Singles Ward. And if you aren't familiar, a ward is like a congregation. That's what they call it. And when you're 18, if you're not married yet, you go to this Singles Ward. So you can only be in it if you are unmarried. And once you are 30, they kick you out. It's like, you're too old. You have to go to the family ward now because you're not married and no one wants you.
Wow, that's crazy. What happens if like you're 50 and I don't know, your wife died or something? Do people just not get married after that, or?
You have to stay in the family ward and hope that you find another person over 30 who's also single in the family ward to get married to. The point is, at least this is what I think, the point is for these singles wards is to get all of the kids to marry each other. So they try and like match you up as quickly as possible with another Mormon. So you make a whole bunch of Mormon babies and the cycle continues. And so I was having like a jolly old time in the singles ward. We did fun activities, hiking, all this fun stuff. And I was dating someone. So I was 19, like the prime Mormon age to get married. And and we had been dating for a year, and I was still a virgin because purity culture is very intense. We're going to talk about this. And, you know, he wanted me to do things that boyfriends want. And I was like, are you sure? Because this is a really big deal. This is a sin. You're not even supposed to kiss for longer than like 3 seconds.
Surprised that he even brought it up, being the Mormon boy that he was, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, apparently we have needs. Weird, right?
Who knew? Yeah.
Who knew? I mean, I, of course, was down. I wanted to do it because I had a high sex drive. What teenager doesn't, right? I'm 19,
right.
And I'm like, yeah, I love this person. I'm planning on marrying him. He was my person. And so to me, I was like, what's the big deal? I'm not like going out around the town and being all slutty and stuff, according to Mormon standards. And so we did it. And right after, he was like, oh, we should go talk to the bishop. And I was just like, really? Oh. Yeah, it was like immediate regret. And so he drags me into this because if one person tells, then the other person gets called in. You don't have a choice.
And at this point, did you believe? Were you on your way out?
Yeah. Okay. No, I totally believed it.
Okay.
I was 100%, I am going to that top level of heaven. And the things that I were more lenient on, it was like the modesty thing, because we lived in Vegas. I'm not going to wear shorts to my knees. I'm going to wear tank tops. I didn't feel like that was a crazy sin like they said it was. And I still hadn't smoked I hadn't drank any alcohol, hadn't even tried coffee. Like, I was living the rules except for the modesty and except for sort of messing around with my boyfriend, which, again, I thought I was going to marry him. So I was like, it's not a big deal. So I go into this bishop's office and he just makes me feel like a worthless piece of shit. And I was like, wow. He calls me not spiritual enough. He says that my boyfriend should break up with me because I'm not a good influence on him. Just all the blame on me. And even goes after my job. He was like, well, I know that you work on Sundays. And I'm like, yeah, it's a requirement of the job. He's like, well, maybe you should consider changing jobs. And so he's just like laying it on thick. Even goes as far as to say, orthodox is unnatural. It's not in the Bible. It's wrong. And I'm like, but once you're married, it's fine. And he's like, well, yeah, once you're married, it's totally fine. And I was so angry. None of it made any sense.
What a bizarre belief system. Okay.
I know. I found out later that in the 80s, they actually did implement this rule where even if you're married, you couldn't do oral sex with your partner. And of course, everyone was like, no, we're not doing that. And so then they reversed it. But this guy, this bishop, who I have to confess to, alone in a room, asking about my sex life, he lived in that era. So I think it's still in his mind that it's wrong.
So you had to like describe the entire situation to him, I guess.
Yeah. And this bishop, he didn't ask me really, really gruesome details, but I have had friends. It's bishop roulette. You don't know who you're going to get. These people aren't screened. They're not trained. They're like the local plumber. They're not clergymen really in any sort of biblical way, or they don't know how to handle these situations, and some of them are super creepy. And I've had friends who get asked these questions like, did you like it? Were you on top? Did you order? Like really inappropriate things.
So where does the bishop sit? Is he like at the top of a ward, or?
Yes.
How many are there per congregation? Just one, or?
Yeah, there's one bishop per ward, and within a certain radius, there are multiple wards, and that would equal a stake. So then you have like a stake president, and then you have the bishop who is in charge of this specific churches. So it's just one guy, and then he has a council. So like first counselor, second counselor. And after it was my emotional break. I was like, this sucks, and I feel like crap. And I even called my mom crying in the parking lot. I was like, Mom, I'm not spiritual enough. And she was furious because I was like her most religious kid. And she was like, what do you mean? You're more spiritual than I am. And she was pissed about it. And so she was trying to build me back up, and I was just shut down. And that's what they do, is they beat you down to where you feel like you're nothing and you need them. So I went home and I was like, okay, if this isn't true, I'm suffering for no reason. And finally, for the first time, I was willing to do all of the research without any blinders on, without any bias. I was like, all right, let's see what the internet has to say. The internet had a lot to say.
Wow, that's fascinating. So where did you start with your research? Was there a specific website or YouTube channel, or?
Such a good question. So this would have been in 2011. So it's been a while. I can't recall exactly where I started. I think I just started typing in questions like truth claims Mormonism, or is Mormonism true, or I don't know. I just went down so many rabbit holes. I started Googling, I don't know, at like 4 p.m. and didn't stop until the sun came up. I was just on it. I was ready to research. And all of these things came up, and we can talk about specific ones if you want. But when I discovered them, I was like, oh, it's all made up. I don't have to believe this anymore. It was just so obvious to me. And that was the first time I really had freedom.
Was there one specific thing that kind of broke the dam? Was it the hat thing, you think?
It wasn't the hat thing. So there's one that's like the most damning piece of evidence, in my opinion, for Joseph Smith. So again, Joseph Smith, the prophet of the church. Apparently, God and Jesus came, they descended down in a pillar of light and told him, none of these churches on earth are true. You need to restore my one true church. So, I mean, every church believes that. They're like the only one, right? And so if Joseph Smith is lying, it all comes crumbling down. So for me, it was finding out that the book of Abraham was completely wrong, because here's this guy who's saying that he's translating the Book of Mormon through these golden plates, which no one actually saw. They said that they saw them, and they have like witness statements in the Book of Mormon saying, I saw the golden plates, but you find out later that they saw them with their spiritual eyes, and most of those men ended up getting excommunicated or left the church for another guy that they thought was the prophet. So not very credible witnesses.
Oopsie daisy.
So conveniently, those golden plates were taken back to heaven by an angel, so no one can actually look at them and be like, oh yeah, let's translate this. Now we know linguistics and we can actually do something about this. But what he did not think about, because he was getting a little cocky and he's like, I can translate anything. He purchased a mummy, like from a traveling mummy show from Egypt. Inside was a script, like an Egyptian funeral script. But he didn't know that, and he was like, guys, I can translate this. And so he did the thing. It turns into Book of Abraham, which is a part of the Book of Mormon series. There's like, you get the Bible, the Old and New Testament, you get the Book of Mormon, which is like a collection of books, and then you have Book of Abraham, Pearl of Great Price, and Doctrine and Covenants.
And is that all part of the Book of Mormon, or?
Yeah, it's very much all connected, and there's a lot of pertinent things about Mormonism in the Book of Abraham through these revelations. So the funny thing is we still have it because it was an actual document that existed.
It was real.
It was real, like because he got it from a mummy. So he was like, I can translate this, but no one at the time could translate Egyptian. And so he was using the power of God. Well, now that we have Egyptologists that know how to do that, they went back and translated it, and they're like, no, this is like a regular funeral script that is super common and in every sarcophagi out there.
Such a shame that like this fell into his hands, and it seems like a real important part of history, and he just was, he had no idea what to do with it,
Yeah. So he just made up all this stuff. And to me, I was like, okay, well, if you can get that wrong, guarantee he made the rest up. And now, like, they've even admitted that, well, he was inspired by the document. I'm like, he was inspired by funerary text to create all this crazy mumbo jumbo. The Book of Abraham is the most wacky one out there. I remember reading it as a kid and being like, what? So that was probably the number one thing where I was like, clearly his translating skills are not what he says they were.
Convenient excuse. He translated it spiritually rather than literally, right?
Mm-hmm. With that whole first vision, it's a huge, huge part of Mormon theology, him seeing God and Jesus and the whole restoration thing. And I found out that there's multiple versions. There's like 7 or 8 versions, maybe more. And they're all very different. In one account, he saw one person, and another it was 2, and one it was an angel. There's a lot of big changes to where I'm like, okay, well, I feel like if you saw Jesus and God, you'd be like, oh, I remember what that was like. But he changed it, and the church doesn't even use the first one or the last one. It's like somewhere in the, like version 4. And so I'm thinking, well, this should be really important, and it shouldn't be changing. So that was another big thing. And then like the plural wives thing, finding out that he was marrying like 14-year-old girls and sister combos and mother-daughter combos.
It's complete hypocrisy.
Yeah, he just turned out to be kind of a slimy guy. And I was upset about that because I held him in very high esteem. I didn't worship him like he was Jesus or anything, but I had a testimony, is what they would call it, that he was a true prophet of God. And turns out he was kind of a slime ball.
As far as prophets go, do they believe that like everybody receives prophecy in the same way that Joseph Smith did, or is it only a couple of people through history? Or
yeah, that's a really great question. So initially, when Joseph Smith restored and was starting the church, he was saying that anyone could receive prophetic visions, and then people would come forward and be like, I saw God, and God said that we need to do this, and then he's like, whoa, I think we need to back up a little. And then he changed it so he was the only one that could actually receive prophecy, and everyone else was just like talking to demons or something. So now it's just passed on from prophet to prophet. So the next prophet was Brigham Young after Joseph Smith was murdered, and Brigham Young was like this horrible, awful, disgusting man who did really awful things to settle Utah. That's like a whole episode in itself.
And then got a university named after him.
Yeah, he should not have that. There should not be anything named after that man.
Yeah, I understand he's a complete scumbag. You mentioned actually Joseph Smith was murdered. He was pushed out a window, wasn't he?
Yeah, there are some conspiracies around that because there was a mob that attacked the jail where he was, and some people say it was an inside job. Some people say, like, the people that he was in jail with that were part of the church actually shot him. I don't really know. Maybe someone else out there who's more researched in that would know. But yes, he was murdered.
Why don't we talk about some of the bigger issues in Mormonism now? Like, just give me the top 3 problems that you have with the way that the church operates, the things that it's done, and then we can hit each one and, dig into each individually.
There's so many. Where do we even start? I think one of my biggest issues, and this is probably because I know some people find comfort in Mormonism and it makes them happy to have a community and to go somewhere on Sundays and to feel included. And I can understand that. I was part of that community and I know what that feels like. But when you're required to give 10% of your income to an organization who is actively fighting against gay marriage, for example, or there's this really horrific case going on right now. It was just dismissed a couple days ago in Arizona with a sex abuse case, which we can get into. This church is stockpiling hundreds of billions of dollars and using like 0.001% of it for humanitarian efforts.
You said a minute ago that you're required to tithe. That's a little bit different than other churches, right? It's like a hard requirement. Like you cannot be a full member unless they see your like tax return, basically, right? And you give every dime to them.
Yeah, so I call it a pay-to-play situation, kind of like Scientology, and current Mormons would argue with me, but it really is the case because if you want a temple recommend, that big shiny castle we were talking about, and you can only get to the highest level of heaven if you go to the big shiny castle, you have to pay 10% of your income to get that recommend, and they literally scan it at the door, and if it beeps like, nope, unworthy, you can't go in.
Modernized, wow.
Yeah. Yeah, it used to be like handwritten, but now it's all digitized. So you would have this end of year thing with your bishop. So if he noticed that you hadn't been paying your tithing every month, he would call you in for like a year-end review and would ask you, are you a full tithe payer? And you can lie, but then you'll feel guilty about it. So you have to, I think they called it like a settlement meeting or something. I forget the words. They just changed it because it sounded gross. But yeah, you have to pay 10%. And if you're a real good Mormon, you'll pay 10% of your income before taxes are taken out. That's a lot of money for people.
It is. That's crazy. So you said they're hoarding hundreds of billions of dollars, right? Why don't we get into that first? Talk about that.
So there was a whistleblower a couple years ago who released one of their bank statements. And I don't think he works there now, but he was a stock portfolio manager at Ensign Peak, which is the church's one of their main stock funds or stockholders or what, I don't know the terminology. You guys get it. So he released a statement showing that just sitting in one bank account, just one, there was $100 billion. And everyone was like, what? What are they doing with this money? You could end hunger in the United States, maybe even multiple countries with this money. And what are you doing with it? And so there's that. He also recently came out about 3 months ago talking about how they were misusing the funds and they shouldn't keep their tax exempt status because of the way that they were misusing their funds. There was a whole thing, I think it was on CNN or 60 Minutes. So yeah, you can look into that. And he's like, I was a member in good standing. I couldn't sit by and perpetrate what is going on behind the scenes, and I have to tell someone about it because the church teaches you all about honesty and integrity, and that is something that they do not practice themselves.
Yeah, the fascinating thing to me about the Mormon church is the fact that being a church, tax-exempt companies have to file a report. They don't have to pay taxes, but they have to file a report. But churches don't even have to file a report. They just say, I'm a church, and suddenly they're exempt from like literally everything. So the Mormon church may be, for all we know, the richest like corporation in existence. Like who knows how much money they have, That's what's so disturbing about it.
Yeah, and John Dehlin over at Mormon Stories podcast, he's awesome. He talks about his estimates are the church has approximately $300 billion. And that's not even including assets and their stocks. Like, one of the things that I found out when I was leaving is that they invest in like soda and alcohol, which everyone is like, why is that a big deal? Because those are so off limits. And so I'm like, what? You can't invest in the devil's juice if you say you can't have it.
It's like Jehovah's Witnesses are indirectly invested in Philip Morris, like cigarette companies and stuff. It is the height of hypocrisy. It just blows me away that, when this came out, like, how are there still members in this,
They go to poor countries and they say the reason you're poor is because you're not paying your tithing. And they will literally tell people, pay your tithing before you feed your family and God will provide. Sometimes God doesn't provide.
Sounds like prosperity gospel.
It's really, really disturbing. So that's just one more thing that I wanted to talk about. When you have a church that has $100 billion in one bank account and you're telling these people who can't feed their families to give you money, that's really disgusting to me.
There was a case that was dismissed not too long ago, right? What was that?
I believe it started in 2020. What happened was, and I hope I get all the details right, I had a lawyer come on my channel to make sure that I was saying everything properly when we discussed it a few days ago.
Well, people can go to your channel. I'll put a link to the video in the comments if you want to see like the full thing.
Yeah, I'll try and give the best cliff notes that I can. It's really dark. So there was a video that surfaced in New Zealand of a guy abusing an infant or a child. I don't know what age the video was taken because he had been doing this from his daughter's infancy throughout her childhood. They tracked it down, found out it was this Mormon guy in Arizona, and we came to find out also that this guy had been confessing his sins to his bishop for years. So this bishop knew about it and did not go and report it to authorities because in the handbook, the bishop's handbook, it tells them to call the church hotline before you call authorities. So he called the hotline, says, hey, this thing is happening. What do I do? The official church lawyers from Curtin and McConkie law firm told him on a few occasions, you cannot go to the authorities. Not you should not, or you don't have to, because they're in that state specifically, they are not considered mandatory reporters, which is insane to me that not every state has that as a law. But they were saying, no, you cannot report it. And so they were in a big lawsuit. The church was sued and the case was dismissed because it was still in law that he wasn't required to report the abuse. And they were like celebrating about it.
Absolutely wild that they get away with this. I know Jehovah's Witnesses have dealt with the exact same thing with telling their members not to report it or discouraging them from reporting things culturally, doing everything they can to avoid the legal classification of clergy so that they, whatever, so they don't have to report certain things to this group, but they do to that group. It's like the biggest scumbag move in existence. Like, why would they fight so hard against preventing this kind of thing from happening?
Yeah, and something that I read in one of the articles about this case was that the church, the LDS Church, and Jehovah's Witnesses and the Catholic Church were actively lobbying to keep this law in place so they didn't have to be mandatory reporters. So I'm just like, not only do you say you're about family and you want to protect the kids, you are actively preventing that from happening.
One of my biggest problems is not necessarily that this exists. Child abuse exists in these groups. I feel like it probably exists in like every demographic, right? It's a problem that society deals with. My problem primarily is with how they handle it. Why are they covering this stuff up? They're making themselves a prime target for people to take advantage of that situation. I know Jehovah's Witnesses were, at one point, they had a rule. It's called a two-witness rule. I think it's still in effect. Unless there are two victims or two witnesses, this has to just go away. Pretend it didn't happen. Clamp it. Just don't say a word and move on with your life. And, of course, people see this loophole and are taking advantage of it. They abuse somebody and then move to a new congregation because, just one witness, one victim, can't say a word to anybody. And then they abuse somebody in the next congregation, and then they move to another. And they just kept doing that over and over and over again for decades. And this specific rule, this loophole, was eventually closed in a roundabout way in the 90s. There are still a lot of issues that are leading to so many lawsuits, it's ridiculous. But I just don't get where their heads are at.
Yeah, it's really disgusting, just because when these are children that you're trying to protect and you're doing the opposite, and you're supposed to be the Church of Jesus Christ, the one and only Church of Jesus, and you are not protecting these kids. I have to give a little bit of credit to the church in, I believe it was England, who just passed a law or a rule saying that all bishops need background checks, which to me is a given, but they're the only ones that are doing it. So there have been multiple cases of bishops who are assaulting these kids in these one-on-one purity interviews. And again, it starts at age 12 all the way until you die. You have to go in one-on-one with a bishop, confess your sins, and they ask you sexual questions. And I think that is so wrong. In fact, one of these bishops, his name is Sam Young, just recently came out, I think it was last year, and he was like, hey, church, I don't want to do these one-on-one interviews with kids. This is really disturbing to me. They excommunicated him for standing up and saying anything. And then only after they excommunicated him, they implemented, okay, now you can bring a parent in with you, which is also how about we just don't do the sex questions? How about we don't do these interviews that just make you feel like crap? And also, yes, on one hand, I'm okay, that's good that a parent can be there. But on the other hand, I don't want my mom in the room when I'm talking about giving my boyfriend a what are we doing? What are we doing here?
That is wild. So parents are in the room when they have these conversations, or?
They're allowed to be. They have the option of being in the room now, as far as I'm aware.
It's wild to me that it's just one guy that stood up to say this, he doesn't want to do this anymore. You said that guy was excommunicated. What exactly does that mean? Because Jehovah's Witnesses have this hierarchy where there's somebody that's disfellowshipped and that's shunned completely from friends and family forever until they're reinstated. And that takes that's a year-long process usually. And then they have a level beyond that, which is apostate. And they're mentally diseased, and they'll infect you with their Satan or whatever. What are the levels? Is there a shunning process in Mormonism in the same way, or?
It's very similar. So as far as I know, based on my interviews with ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, the process of getting excommunicated is basically the same, where you go in front of this jury of men who sit across from you, and you have to explain what you did and how you're sorry, and it always ends with, well, you're excommunicated anyway. And that just means in Mormonism that they take away your membership and you have to be rebaptized in. So if Jesus decides to come back, you are no longer a member and you're basically screwed. You can't participate in meetings in a meaningful way. You can't give prayers. So there's always opening, closing prayers with every single little meeting that you go to, even within church. There were 3 hours of church when I went. Now there's only 2, but there's an opening, closing prayer at each hour of that. So you can't, if someone says, hey, Shalice, could you give the prayer? I'd have to be no. And that's really embarrassing for me. And everyone goes, oh, she's not worthy. So there's that. You can't take the sacrament, which is the bread and water that they pass around.
Is that in the temple, the sacrament, or is that in normal meetings?
No, that's a normal every week thing at Sunday. On Sundays. It's basically a public shaming thing, and you have to go through the repentance process. And then after a year, I think it's usually a year, and it depends on the severity of the sin, I guess. You would go back and beg and be please, can I be let back in? And then you would get rebaptized, and then you're back in. But they don't do the really intense shunning that Jehovah's Witnesses do. It's more subtle. So if someone is excommunicated, but they fully intend to get reinstated, they will be love bombed and you got this and we're here for you and we support you. If they're excommunicated for something, maybe they were standing up for Sam Young and they're I also don't think that bishops should have to have sexual interviews with children. And they excommunicate you and you're yeah, I don't want to go back because why are they punishing me for this? then you would be seen as an apostate. And then, so we have the same thing. I always say apostates unite.
Right.
So it depends on the family. It depends on your upbringing. It depends on where you live, how people are going to treat you. But generally speaking, and they talk about this often, even in the most recent second annual general conference, they're talking about don't even talk to the apostates because they may put ideas in your head, and stay away from them. Think celestial is what they said. They're like, think celestial. So avoid anyone who might contaminate your spirituality.
That's fascinating. Yeah, Jehovah's Witnesses I feel like they have a much simpler system where, you know, you guys have like apostate, excommunication, you have disfellowshipped also, right?
Yeah, there is something that's disfellowshipped, and I think it's just not as extreme as excommunicated. I think you still retain your membership, but you still can't take the sacrament or give prayers, and it's probably a lesser time period than the year that's like generally for the excommunicated people. So there are different levels, but yeah, I was never really close with anyone who had that happen to them, so I'm not 100% sure. And also, I don't know how they do it now because they're changing things and changing the names of things and doing it a little bit differently.
Yeah, it's kind of weird coming out of the religion and being out of it for as long as you and I have both been, and now looking back and seeing how like completely different it is now. So how does your family and how do your old friends interact with you now? Do they? How has your life changed since leaving?
So I have one friend who's an absolute angel and has never judged me or treated me differently since leaving. I think she sees the humanity in me and chooses to ignore that I'm led by Satan, or maybe she secretly thinks that, I don't know, but she doesn't treat me any differently. So that's really great. My immediate family is no longer in, so I feel very fortunate about that because some families do ostracize their own children, and I've seen it in my extended families. I've seen that happen. And my extended family, well, they don't really talk to me. I think they might if I reached out, but probably just to extend the olive branch of come back to the church, you know? So it's hard to know if anyone really cares about you in a way that doesn't have ties to the religion, or if they just want to save your soul and they don't really care, like whatever it takes to get Shalice to come back so she goes to the right heaven and not outer darkness, because Mormons don't have hell. It's just like a black abyss that you float in forever. They actually did object lessons like that when we were kids, and they would take us into these rooms decorated like the kingdoms, and then they took us to a room that was completely blacked out, and they're like, this is outer darkness, and we're like, oh no, I don't want to be here. It was like really terrifying.
So odd. It's like so different. I mean, I'm sitting here saying how odd, coming from a Jehovah's Witness background, one of the more odd religions, you know, but things that are different from what we're used to are just strange to us, you know?
Yeah, we do have the millennium thing, though, which is very similar to yours, the whole Armageddon doomsday thing. When Jesus comes back, all of the righteous Mormons are going to be literally lifted off of the planet, and then God is going to burn everyone else alive in this like fiery torment thing, and then he's going to make the planet perfect again in a paradise, and then lower us back down, and we'll live there for 1,000 years without Satan tempting us. It's called the millennium.
That's super interesting. Oh my God, yeah. That is kind of how it is with Jehovah's Witnesses, although I think that they believe that 144,000 Jehovah's Witnesses are going to be lifted up and become angels and given heaven swords to like kill the people they didn't like. And then the rest of us have to make it through 7 years. And after that 7 years, you know, fireballs rain down, it's Armageddon, and then paradise on earth. All the fireballs will kill all of the unrighteous people, because I guess the angels, you know, there are only so many angels, so you got to get fireballs in there to finish the job. But anyway, your channel is Cults to Consciousness. That's the name of it, and I'm going to put a link to it in the description again for anybody who wants to see it. We're actually releasing this video in tandem. If anybody wants to see another interview with me on your channel, they can go over there, right?
Yeah, we're going to get into all the juicy details of Owen here. It's going to be so much fun getting into your specific personal story, because we do deep dives on my channel about like an hour long or a little bit more. So I'm sure your people are going to be excited to hear more about you.
100%. So go check it out if you want to hear a breakdown of my personal story and some of the deeper lore about Jehovah's Witnesses. Maybe I'll get into the Jehovah's Witness Smurf story. That's absolutely fascinating. We'll see. Just go over there and check it out if you want to hear about it. Anyway, yeah, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I could ramble on about the craziness of Mormonism all day, so I appreciate you giving me the opportunity, and it's been great to connect.